He fired me for my image. I bought his company and returned the favor. The opulent, glass-walled headquarters of Hartmann Company, a name synonymous with luxury fashion in the heart of New York City, was where my nightmare began. I was Luka, a 27-year-old marketing specialist of Maltese descent, and I had poured my very soul into that company for 3 grueling years. Late nights, innovative campaigns, a social media presence boosted by 300%. I was passion personified, and I foolishly believed I was valued. But on one seemingly ordinary Monday morning, I was summoned to a meeting with my boss, Richard, the senior vice president of marketing. He was the epitome of corporate arrogance, always impeccably dressed in ridiculously overpriced suits, flaunting his Rolex collection like a badge of superiority. He looked down on anyone who didn't fit his narrow, elitist vision. The city skyline stretched serenely behind him as I sat across the polished table in that sterile conference room, a file containing my employment record open before him. My stomach twisted into knots because I already knew what was coming. "We just don't feel like you fit the company's image anymore," he stated coldly, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "What?" I managed to choke out. "Look, it's nothing personal, Luka," he continued, his voice devoid of any genuine empathy. "You're just not quite what we're looking for in our leadership team." My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "What are you looking for?" Richard, and a nerve in silence hung heavy in the air. "We appreciate everything you've done," he finally said, his tone out till he hollow, "but we're moving in a different direction. HR will send over your severance package. You'll need to clear out your desk by the end of the day." The floor seemed to vanish beneath me, leaving me suspended in disbelief and shock. Just like that, no warning, no real reason, just not fitting the company's image. I stood up slowly, forcing myself to maintain some semblance of composure. "This is a mistake," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. I left that office utterly humiliated, betrayed, and consumed by a burning fury. They thought I would disappear, that I'd fade into obscurity. But they were dead wrong. I emerged from Hartmann Company's towering headquarters clutching a cardboard box, my entire career reduced to a few paltry belongings. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges, my mind reeling from the devastating encounter. Fired, just like that. Stepping onto the bustling chaos of Fifth Avenue, I felt utterly frozen, an island of despair amidst the swirling crowds. People rushed past, taxis honked, completely oblivious to my personal earthquake. I sought refuge in a nearby cafe, the very one where I used to grab coffee before heading to work. As I sat down, my phone buzzed with messages from co-workers who had just heard the news. Some offered words of support, while others remained conspicuously silent. But one message stood out, a single text from Melissa, my closest friend in the office. He said, "You didn't have the right look for the company." "I'm so sorry." My anger surged. I wasn't some corporate robot in a tailored suit like Richard. I didn't schmooze at rooftop parties. But I worked hard, and because I didn't fit his perfect little image, I was disposable. My coffee grew cold as I replayed every late night, every sacrifice, every idea Richard had shamelessly stolen. I had no backup, no job lined up, no safety net. I wanted to scream, to break something. Instead, I swallowed my pride and did what I had to do. I called every contact I had, updated my resume, and braced myself for the brutal reality that awaited. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I went from working in a sleek Manhattan office to scraping by, taking whatever freelance marketing gigs I could find just to keep the lights on in my tiny Brooklyn apartment. At first, I thought I'd bounce back quickly. I had experience, a solid portfolio, and the fashion industry, though competitive, was supposedly open to new talent. But then came the rejections. "We're impressed with your portfolio, but we're going in a different direction." Or worse, radio silence after what seemed like promising conversations. It wasn't long before I realized what was happening. Richard was actively sabotaging my career. Whispers reached me through old contacts. Rumors that Richard had painted me as a difficult team player, an unreliable employee, essentially making me unemployable. I burned through my savings faster than I expected, forced to sell my car and the apartment I had worked so hard for, relocating to a tiny studio in Queens. Every rejection email, every unpaid invoice, every sleepless night fueled my rage and determination. I didn't just take whatever work I could get. I started working with small brands, meticulously learning the business side of fashion. I connected with designers, manufacturers, and suppliers, piecing together the intricate workings of the industry, uncovering how they secured funding and navigated the cutthroat world of luxury goods. And then, one day, I found my opening. An investor I had worked with on a small project reached out with a proposition. A struggling luxury brand desperately seeking a turnaround. They needed someone who could revive their image, someone who understood the modern market. The brand, it was teetering on the brink of collapse, but I saw its potential, its hidden value. I knew this was my shot. For 5 relentless years, I worked harder than I ever had before. I built that brand from the ground up, transforming it into a profitable, formidable competitor. I learned everything about the industry that Richard had deliberately kept from me, every secret, every connection, every strategy. And then, 5 years later, the news crackled with a delicious irony. Hartmann and Company was in deep trouble. By the time Hartmann and Company started crumbling, I was no longer the desperate, discarded ex-employee it had casually dismissed. I was the CEO of a direct competitor, making waves and disrupting the industry. For years, I had watched from the sidelines, biding my time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I kept tabs on Richard, and while my company was thriving, his was stagnating. Hartmann and Company was outdated, clinging to antiquated traditions and ignoring the rapidly evolving market. Sales began to plummet, and their once loyal investors started getting nervous. And then came the hammer blow, and exposed revealing the toxic workplace conditions at Hartmann. Former employees coming forward with harrowing stories of discrimination and unethical firings. The industry finally turned against them, and who did the press eagerly seek out for commentary? Me. I gave carefully crafted interviews, subtly yet pointedly criticizing outdated practices and elitist mindsets that plagued the industry. I spoke about how fashion needed to evolve, how employees needed to be valued, how companies that clung to outdated, discriminatory practices were doomed to fail. I never mentioned Richard by name, but anyone paying attention knew exactly who I was talking about. Hartmann and Company was hemorrhaging money, desperately needing a bailout, and that's when I made my move. Through a series of strategic partnerships, I orchestrated an offer to acquire Hartmann and Company. It wasn't a hostile takeover. I didn't want them to suspect anything. I let them believe I was an ally, a fellow entrepreneur extending a lifeline. Richard didn't even realize who was behind the deal until it was far too late. I made sure he was the first to know. Of course, I had my assistant schedule a meeting in Hartmann and Company's boardroom, the very room and my dreams had been so brutally crushed. Richard, expecting to meet some nameless executive, instead saw me sitting at the head of the table, a triumphant smirk playing on my lips. Long time no see, Richard, I said, savoring the dawning confusion in his eyes, the creeping dread that slowly transformed his arrogant expression. He pulled out a chair slowly, as if he couldn't quite process the reality of the situation. What is this, Luka? I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment stretch, the anticipation building. These, I said, sliding a folder across the table, are your termination papers. You're done. He grabbed the folder, frantically flipping through it as if he could somehow argue his way out of this. You can't do this to me. His voice was laced with disbelief. I built this company. I simply smiled, a cold, detached expression on my face. No, Richard, you did this to yourself. For years, he had destroyed careers, acted as a gatekeeper, and treated people like they were disposable cogs in his corporate machine. Now, the roles were reversed. Security, I said, snapping my fingers. Voice caught you out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to fight back, a loophole, anything. I stood up, straightening my suit, and started towards the door. But my revenge wasn't just about firing him. No, this was only the beginning. As I walked out of the boardroom, Richard stormed after me, his expensive leather shoes slamming against the polished floor. Employees, who had once hung on to his every word, now watched in stunned silence as the mighty Richard Saunders, the untouchable executive, was unraveling before their very eyes. You think you can just take everything from me? He sputtered, his face contorted with rage. I made this company what it is. I kept my expression neutral, my voice calm and controlled. And now I own it. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I'll fight this, he threatened. You have no right. I cut him off, my voice sharp and dismissive. I have every right. Do you think this happened overnight? Do you think this is some coincidence? I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice so only he could hear. For years, I took it. I waited. And now, it's my turn. His bravado faltered, his eyes widening in dawning comprehension. He stammered. You don't understand how this world works, Luka, he said desperately. People like I stopped him, my voice dripping with venom. People like me, people who didn't fit his polished, curated corporate image. He swallowed hard, shaking his head. No, I said, cutting him off, because unlike you, I don't need to tear people down to stay on top. I gestured towards the glass walls, where a crowd of employees had gathered, watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. They don't respect you, Richard. They never did. You were just a guy with power. I could see the realization sinking in, the crushing weight of his impending downfall. Security, I said again, with a simple nod, and to guard stepped forward. You're actually doing this, he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. I learned from the best, I replied coldly. Security flanked him on both sides, and he tried to push past them, his voice turning frantic. Luka, let's talk about this. You don't have to do this. Goodbye, Richard, I said, turning my back on him. And with that, they escorted him past the very employees he had once ruled over, past the glass doors, and onto the streets of Manhattan. The humiliation was complete. Richard Saunders, the untouchable executive, had finally been crushed. But I wasn't done yet, because now it was time to dismantle his legacy, to erase him from the very fabric of the company. Destroying Richard's reputation was just the beginning. I wanted to erase everything he stood for, to make sure his name was nothing more than a footnote in Hartmann's history. So I did what he never saw coming. I rebranded the company from the ground up. The first step was scrubbing every trace of Richard Saunders from Hartmann Company. His name was removed from all internal documents, press releases, and historical records. Any campaign he had ever attached his name to was immediately shelved. Then I announced a full-scale company overhaul, a complete shift in branding that appealed to the modern luxury consumer, something Richard had stubbornly refused to adapt. I rehired the very people he had fired, offering them the jobs and salaries they deserved. I brought in fresh talent, innovative designers, and social media strategists who knew how to make the brand explode online. The industry took notice, hailing Hartmann Company as the fashion world's greatest comeback story, a masterclass in corporate reinvention. And then came the final, decisive move. At an exclusive industry gala, one that Richard used to attend every year, I took the stage, bathed in the bright lights, surrounded by the biggest names in fashion. I unveiled Hartmann Company's new name. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice ringing with pride and triumph, I am thrilled to announce that Hartmann Company will now be known as Bianca New York. Bianca New York, my mother's name, my legacy. The audience erupted in applause. The media loved the symbolism, the fired employee taking over and renaming the empire that had once rejected her. Later that night, a blurry video surfaced, showing Richard watching the announcement on his phone in a dimly lit bar, his face twisted in disbelief and utter defeat, like a man who had lost everything. Because he had his reputation destroyed, his untouchable status shattered, his legacy erased. For years, he had played king, thinking he was untouchable, but in the end, he was just another fallen tyrant, watching from the outside as the empire he fought eat and thrived without him. As I walked away, I knew that true revenge isn't just about taking someone down. It's about ensuring they can never rise again. Standing in my corner office, overlooking the thriving metropolis of New York, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. For so long, I had been fueled by revenge, by the burning need to destroy the man who had destroyed me. I had taken everything from him, piece by piece, until he was nothing. But now, as the city lights twinkled beneath me, I had to ask myself, what's next? Bianca New York wasn't just a fashion brand. It was a movement, a symbol of changing an industry desperate for innovation. It was a brand that valued creativity over politics, talent over connections. The same industry that had once blacklisted me was now calling me a visionary. But more importantly, the people who had been cast aside by men like Richard were now thriving under my leadership. Melissa, my old co-worker who had warned me about Richard's schemes, was now my head of communications. The designers and creatives Richard had dismissed were now leading some of our most successful campaigns. I had everything I had ever wanted, and more. One night, as I was leaving the office late, I received a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? You'll always be nothing. It was Richard. I chuckled softly and blocked the number. He was still clinging to a past that no longer existed, a past that he had destroyed himself. Because real power isn't in revenge, it's in what comes after. And I had a whole empire to build. So, Reddit, I'm turning to you, knowing the whole story, the sacrifices made, and the calculated moves taken. Did I handle this situation the right way? What would you have done differently? Was my revenge justified? Or did I take things too far? I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on how I navigated this complex and transformative chapter of my life. Considering the lengths I went to reclaim what was unjustly taken from me and the legacy I sought to build in its place.